Good morning again and welcome to Face the Nation. We start today with what may be the biggest story of the year. It began back in June when National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden began leaking top-secret documents. Those documents disclosed government programs involving surveillance on everyone from ordinary Americans to our closest international allies. Joining us now is General Michael Hayden, who is the former head of the National Security Agency and the CIA and is now a principal of the Chertoff Group here in Washington. General Hayden, good morning.
Morning.
Before we get to the NSA and surveillance, and a lot of ground to cover there, there is a lead story in the New York Times this morning that talks about a months-long investigation the paper conducted into the Benghazi attack. It says there is no clear linkage to Central Command al-Qaeda, and that there was a much messier situation on the ground than originally disclosed by the administration or thought by most observers. Your reaction to that story?
Yeah, I think that has the ring of truth to it. And in general, Major, these kinds of events are a lot more nuanced than we would like them to be, looking back at them in retrospect. When the attack happened, actually on this network a few days afterwards, I was asked who did it. And I said, well, you know, the al-Qaeda movement's divided into three layers: al-Qaeda Prime, formerly affiliated, and like-minded. And at the time I said this was probably high-end like-minded or low-end affiliated. And I think the Times story today kind of bears that out.
And when you say like-minded, you mean locals who have anti-American sentiments, al-Qaeda sort of passions in their veins?
And a broad belief system that's consistent with the al-Qaeda vision.
And these are the locals the United States thought it had a relationship with, and that relationship turned sour, then deadly.
Well, we had a relationship with some locals. Obviously, with other locals, we did not. And frankly, I've also offered the view that we had plenty of warning, strategic warning, that Benghazi was simply not a safe place. If you were waiting for tactical warning that an event would happen at this day, at this time, and we're in Benghazi, you weren't waiting for intelligence. You were waiting to die.
Last question on this. If it doesn't have a strong centralized link to al-Qaeda, what does that tell us about the nature of terrorism and terrorist threats?
Right, that the al-Qaeda movement has changed, and actually that's probably the better word, not the al-Qaeda organization, but the al-Qaeda movement. So now you see al-Qaeda from al-Qaeda Prime in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that swath westward, all the way to the west coast of Africa. And the identity, the actual makeup of those al-Qaeda groups shifts a bit as you move westward. A little less al-Qaeda Prime, a little less about the global caliphate, and a little more about local circumstances and local grievances. Now, right now, those groups farthest west don't really consider us to be the prime enemy. But our problem is, what do we do about that? Do we wait until they've gathered more strength and therefore are a threat to us? Or do we move now and perhaps turn a movement that really wasn't mad at us into an enemy of the United States? Tough decisions.
That's an evolving story. And let's now get to where we are with the NSA, the disclosures, the surveillance, and some court rulings. I want to read to you one segment of a ruling handed down by Judge Richard Leon here in Washington, U.S. District Judge, who said, "It's one thing to say that people expect phone companies to occasionally provide information to law enforcement. It's quite another to suggest that our citizens expect all phone companies to operate what is effectively a joint intelligence gathering operation with the government." What do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I would respond that Judge Leon was looking at the acquisition of the data and not how the data was used. And so this is not a broad fishing expedition. Granted, millions, billions of phone records a day are acquired by the National Security Agency. But what follows, Major, is really important. What happens to that data? How often is that data touched? And the truth is, it's touched 200 to 300 times per year, and only based upon a reasonable, articulable suspicion that that number is affiliated with terrorism.
But Judge Leon also talks about, as you said, the acquisition of this data. And he said, underlying Supreme Court precedent, which dates back to a case from 1979, in no way imagined this world that we're currently living in. Let me read again. And this is his words. They're interesting. "The almost Orwellian technology that enables the government to store and analyze the phone metadata of every telephone user in the United States is unlike anything that could have been conceived of in 1979. The notion that the government could collect similar data on hundreds of millions of people and retain that data for a 5-year period, updating it with new data every day in perpetuity, was at best in 1979 the stuff of science fiction. Americans, General, are legitimately, it seems to me, alarmed by the scope and stature of this collection, retention, and sifting.
Sure. Look, Our history as a people demand that we be alarmed, that we be concerned about this. But our concerns should be governed, our thinking should be focused on the facts of the case and not the emotion of the case. Again, what happens to the data? Judge Leon ignored precedent. He ignored Smith versus Maryland, the case that you cited. He ignored that 15 FISA judges on over 30 occasions have upheld the lawfulness of this. And then Judge Pauley in the Southern District of New York, within a week, issued another warning, another decision saying that this was inherently constitutional. And Judge Pauley relied on precedent. Judge Leon relied on exclamation points throughout his judgment, not precedent.
He also said this is likely unconstitutional and this collection violates the Fourth Amendment. You disagree?
I do. Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. I do know there is one controlling Supreme Court case, Smith versus Maryland, in which the court has said in a 5-3 decision that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy over this kind of data.
Once you hand your data over to a third party.
Right.
Now, it's also been disclosed through Edward Snowden's leaks that the NSA tapped fiber optic cables abroad to siphon data, circumvented or cracked encryption codes, and covertly inserted weaknesses into coding mechanisms. Now, you're telling me all of that is done in accordance with the Constitution and raises no Fourth Amendment concerns?
As long as it's done overseas against people not protected by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, Major, the Constitution doesn't enter into the conversation.
What are your thoughts currently on Edward Snowden? Have they evolved in any way?
No, not at all.
What do you think he is?
Well, I used to say he was a defector, and there's a history of defection. Actually, there's a history of defection to Moscow, and that he seems to be part of that stream. I'm now kind of drifting in the direction of perhaps more harsh language.
Such as?
Traitor. I mean,
based on what?
Well, in the past 2 weeks, in open letters to the German and the Brazilian government, he has offered to reveal more American secrets to those governments in return for something, and in return was for asylum. I think there's an English word that describes selling American secrets to another government, and I do think it's treason.
Is the NSA stronger or weaker as a result of Edward Snowden's disclosures?
It's infinitely weaker.
Infinitely?
Infinitely. This is the most serious hemorrhaging of American secrets in the history of American espionage. Look, we've had other spies. We can talk about Hansen and Aldrich Ames, but their damage, as bad as it was fairly limited. And even though in both of those cases, human beings actually lost their lives, but they were specific sources. All right. There's a reason we call these leaks. All right. And if you extend the metaphor, Hansen and Ames, you could argue whether that was a cup of water that was leaked or a bucket of water that was leaked. What Snowden is revealing, Major, is the plumbing. He's revealing how we acquire this information. It will take years, if not decades, for us to return to the position that we had prior to his disclosures.
Are you afraid of more disclosures?
Well, actually, that's a great question, because I saw in your lead-in you've had Mr. Snowden saying, "My work is done." Now, does that mean all the stories based upon the information he's given to the press will stop? No, he said he's accomplished his objective. I've already won. But yet, will the stories stop? I don't think so.
And what are you most afraid of if the stories continue?
What I'm most afraid of is that we will reveal our sources and methods, our tactics, techniques, and procedures to people around the world who will the American nation and the American people harm.
Is it your contention, getting back to what we first talked about, that these techniques, these tactics, these surveillance mechanisms are legitimate legally, but also more important because of the atomized nature of the terrorist threat and affiliated groups with Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, actually, it's a great point, Major, because the 215 program, the metadata program, the one we're talking about, that is actually more ideally suited against that granular, one-off, individualized, self-radicalized attack. It's probably a little less useful to the traditional Al-Qaeda attack, which is that slow-moving, ponderous plot with multiple threads designed for mass casualties against an iconic target. I'm not saying 215 isn't valuable there, but I'm saying there are enough other threads we could pull and perhaps learn about those traditional plots. Now we get plots like a drive-by shooting in Little Rock. We get plots like what happened in Boston at the marathon. We get plots like the Army Major shooting up fellow soldiers in Texas.
General Hayden, it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you.
And to you, Major.